Welcome to the DxTx Partners Podcast. I have Dr. Krishnan Chakravarthy, the president of ASPN, which is the American Society for Pain and Neuroscience. He is an award-winning author, researcher, lecturer, over 100 published papers. Super impressive. Affiliate professor at the University of California at San Diego in anesthesia and nanoengineering, which I know nothing about, but very, very impressive. And an entrepreneur, the founder of NextStem and biotech startups. A lot of interesting things there. It's very diverse background. What kind of got you going down these different paths of research and being an actual treating physician? I mean, everything else.
Well, I want to thank you, Mike. I love. I feel like we've interacted at the Aspen meeting. I've seen all of the previous podcasts. Amazing that you're taking such a wonderful opportunity to continue to educate all the people that are watching. I think sometimes personality, some people just are like gluttonous for punishment. I say that jokingly, but I did everything in the non-traditional way, like whether it was taking a dual degree during my medical school. I took time to do my PhD. And while I was doing my PhD, I ended up starting my first entrepreneurial stint in looking at OLED and semiconductor manufacturing. So I trained a lot as an engineer. I think some part of it, I think, is genetic. My dad was actually a mechanical engineer by training. And then I went into medicine, but it never got I think some part of it is the nature versus nurture concept. And I really do believe a lot of the critical thinking skills that I developed over a lot of the graduate work to the first attempt at doing something entrepreneur has been a lifelong lesson. But I will say one of the biggest take homes I have gotten, especially now that I'm continuing this, is taking steps to doing any type of activity or new venture or any of it takes a lot of courage. And I think a lot of times it's kind of, you jump in the deep end and you hope you kind of build the plane as you're trying to jump off without a parachute. Concept does make sense. I think we all try to plan for these things, but I think that there's a certain type of willingness to put the energy into these things and make it a passion. So I really believe I'm fortunate in this life that I've gotten to treat any of the jobs that I do as a hobby and a passion project, never as work. And I think that lends itself to like really working hard at something and solving it. So,
Well, those of us in the interventional pain space are glad that you chose our space with such a really interesting background. So as the president of Aspen, what do you see as kind of over the next couple of years? It's a rapidly evolving field that we're in, as well as just in medicine in general.
yeah, great question. I think every specialty has important moments where I think their identity changes, and I make this probably about 10, 15 years ago. If you talk to primary care specialists, they would say pain management was all about medication management. And we've seen the trends with all of the stuff that happened with the opiate epidemic and the shift in interventional therapy options. I think today we consider ourselves interventionalists, and I think depending on what part of the generational way of training, there are some very forward thinkers, and there are people who still believe that the types of defined scope of training to where who is a true interventionalist versus who isn't, who should be doing XYZ therapies. I think we are finding that a very multidisciplinary group of people are very much interested in the specialty of pain. And I think where really the call to action is standardizing the training, the data to really build a specialty that I think is really innovative. I mean, an incredible revolution of new ideas and products. I mean, in no other space it has anything like this. I mean, the closest analogy everybody makes is cardiology in the 1950s when people went from open bypass to stents. And that really revolutionized the way pain or cardiology care was done at the level of complex cases. So when you kind of think about where we are, Aspen is really, I think, in a unique society to the credit of Tim and Dawood, who have helped really build it to what it is and continue to see a lot of different visions of different presidents that come in. For me, I think we're at a critical junction where You can have great products, you can have great therapy, you can have great benefits to patients, but it's got to get reimbursed. It's so critical because none of this works in the current healthcare system that is in the United States. And I continue to imagine how complex it is, where, the consumer and the person delivering the service aren't actually in charge of the transactional piece of it. So when we're working with insurance companies, I think we're always trying to define the goalpost, but really it's critically important that we as a society bring more unity in the conversations we're having around our partnerships with industry, the data that we're collecting that's actually meaningful, not just in the clinical setting, but to payers. Two very different objectives. I think that conversation to drive that change is going to be really meaningful, not just with small practices, but big practices like DxTx that are really influencing a lot of lives at a local and regional and national level.
Yeah, we have many physicians across the country that we always talk about function at the top of your license. We have very highly skilled pain surgeons. And with the growing research impacting that coverage policy, and I know Aspen's working on that, but how can us as a DxTx with, a network of, over 100 clinicians, um, how can we help carry that message to impact payers, policymakers to improve that coverage? What do you need from us?
Yeah, no, great question. So, what's fascinating, this was the first year we ran the Pain and Policy Innovation Forum. And it was amazing. We actually had a lot of folks that came from the insurance panel side of things to hear their perspective. What's surprising to me is, we generate a lot of data, a lot of money spent by industry to do these randomized controlled trials with certain endpoints. And when you hear insurance companies, they have a totally different perspective of what's a valid therapy. They want 5-year durability data. They want ODIs and promise scores in the documentation. So I think where we as a specialty can help ourselves is I think we need to really standardize the education of what is it that validates a clinically significant or meaningful outcome on a therapy. Let's say you're treating anterior column pain versus nociceptive or neuropathic pain. And I mean, all of these different pain generators today have very different therapy options. In the past, you didn't really have that. You had a lot less tools in your tool bag. But with more tools, I think there's a big call to action to make sure we are consistent in the way we express success, in the way we express efficacy and safety. And that piece I don't think is really consistent. And I think that partially it's because the training programs, by and far, when you look at ACGME to the diversity of people, minimally invasive spine or more advanced procedures in a year is very difficult. I think, by 6 months, we jokingly say, can a fellow do a good epidural consistently? You're going from there to maybe an entire fusion case through SI joint. I think we need to be responsible, and the expectations of programs need to match what we want to accomplish as a specialty. So I think the big call to action for Aspen, especially under our leadership and my leadership this year, has been trying to focus on data development through a registry. We saw a little bit about the MIS certification course that Dave Dickerson has been working on that's really looking at helping industry and fellowships and all of these to provide another avenue to train these physicians. Because let's be honest, it's just a year's not enough time. I really believe we need a residency. It's been a long time that we have enough of a 3-year curriculum that I would hope that it becomes its own specialty. There's more governance over the patients, more ability to lobby as a specialty. But even if we can't get there, proposals like a 2-year fellowship are wonderful ideas because I think if you can build the foundation right at the beginning before they go into practice, then I think they're a lot more prepared. And then the third big piece of it is that, to the credit of a lot of the folks in the registry panel, we're starting to say, look, can Aspen really deploy a registry that all industry can put data into? Because that's what payers want. They really want to look at data that's out of the clinical setting that supports this. But if everything is capitalism today, Mike, everybody's trying to figure out how to make a bigger dollar, which is really problematic because in healthcare, inherently, we think that health should be a right? I mean, it isn't something that should be governed by profit loss the way any business should. But the unfortunate reality is that that is where we are. So we kind of have to play within the playground of all of these different I think factors that are push and pulling access to care. And that's really at the heart of this is good access to good therapy for patients.
You touched on something that as we recruit physicians, we have openings, throughout the country. As we continue to grow, adding physicians, one of the things that I've seen like shift pretty quickly over the last few years has been the folks in the fellowship programs. It used to be primarily anesthesia. You had some PM&R in there. I talked to a pretty large fellowship group recently. They didn't have a single anesthesiologist in their fellowship program. It was psychiatry, emergency medicine, family medicine, and PM&R. You talk about the longer fellowship, the residency. These are things that I think would be critical. Is there anything else as far as training for people as they enter our field that we're going to have to be ahead of because they may not come out? They're not coming out of their residencies with the same skill level necessarily that they would have had in anesthesia.
No, I think, there's been a alarming decline of potential applicants that are specifically anesthesia based. And I think the challenge here is, what I believe is we all need to be humble enough to realize pain can't, it's such a complex issue. There's social components to it. There's the physiologic and all of these different factors. That being said, the rubric for who is the interventional pain physician has to meet a certain criteria and skill set. And the reason for that is let's set aside access and safety as already a benchmark you have to meet. Long term, you got to get the good outcomes because at the end, what is ultimately claims you get as a device manufacturer is if it's not meeting the real world data, that's exactly what insurance companies use as ammunition to say, why are we paying X amount of dollars to support this? From my perspective, unless there is a radical curriculum change, it is very difficult that a fellowship director can train everybody, especially if they've not have the needle skills. And likewise, anesthesiologists learn a lot from PM&R in terms of a good history and physical for diagnosis. So it isn't to say that one person could be a better pain doctor or another, but it's more to say that there needs to be more rigorous training. On the flip side, if you're not going to be able to change ACGME, I think there's a bigger call to action where practices when they're hiring need to think more about training, right? It's not just the dynamic of you take someone brand new, put them in, and the next day he's doing a big SCS implant case. There's a lot that goes into that. So Aspen to other societies to even industry, how do we really qualify success in training? I think we have a lot of questions to ask because my bigger fear is that when you don't bridge that gap, what really happens is you have your highly qualified physicians that are always pioneering new therapies and new things, but doesn't mean that more patients across the country are getting access to these therapies. So I'll give you a good example. Mild is a great therapy, fantastic. You within a corridor of a zip code, if they came to the right physician at DxTx, is a very different experience than someone who isn't capable of doing it, and then they make the referral to a surgeon. Not to say there aren't great surgeons and great outcomes, but the bottom line is that the access to these therapies is completely contingent on which physician you see. And that's not great for patients because I think patients should have the ability to make choices. And sometimes there are great therapies that are minimally invasive that don't need a large open approach. So I think we have to really continue to really press on education, providing additional ways for training. But we're hoping that, that this becomes a kind of a collective campaign to try and change the education forum. And it is concerning. It's hard to compete when anesthesia pays so well right out of residency. Just not, and sometimes these fellows are demanding these high salaries and you're like, wow, that's not paying as of right now. So I think there's some realism that needs to come with it too.
Yeah, yeah. I'm on the other end of that call when they're asking for more.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. Somebody just brought this up to me recently. I was just at the Aspen conference in Miami. What an amazing event you guys put on. Just so many neat things going on and a lot of just great networking, fellowship. Is there a world where you start bringing in maybe more with neurosurgery ortho spine, and right, it was primarily interventional pain. I know at DxTx we have a little bit of that in our network too. We have a neurosurgeon, we have an orthopedic surgeon. One of our practices is there any integration with those?
I think it has to be. And I'll tell you why, Mike, because I think we sometimes get stuck on, does training necessarily mean you do the procedure? We have to get out of that mindset, because what I mean by that is there's a lot of reluctancies where people are like, oh, is this person qualified to do a procedure or not? And I think that's not really the problem to be solved. I think what we have to really look at is within that context of identifying a patient, can you actually know when to refer a patient versus when you're doing a therapy? So unless we get a more type of multidisciplinary community where that interaction happens, I think it's going to be really tough to solve. So I think we made those attempts. I think we're seeing some of the folks from the surgical community start to attend Aspen. I think likewise, I would love for Aspen to be a part of a session in a CNS Congress, right? Because the more awareness you have of these different therapy options, the more you're going to decide, hey, look, I'm going to make an effort to do that. Now, there are practices, I think, that like DxTx that are hiring multidisciplinary surgeons to pain doctors. I think that is the future. I think the kind of the perioperative surgical model where you have all the different disciplines taking care of the patients, that's where, if you go to value-based care in the long term, that's where it's going to be. So I think we're getting ahead of that by trying to create more of a community of surgeons that are attending. But it's still a work in progress. So, but certainly the conversations have been much more. I think you're hearing it a lot more now, right? A lot of the surgeons
Yeah.
are talking about pain options as even a consideration.
Yeah. It's nice because there's still some, competition in
Yeah.
some areas, but then seeing that come together. Shifting gears, completely shifting gears, because
Yeah.
you have such an interesting background, entrepreneur,
Yeah.
founder,
Yeah.
biotechs. What's kind of in that realm for you right now? What's coming?
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about what you have going from the entrepreneurial side.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would consider myself a serial entrepreneur, good and bad. So I failed at a lot of things before I even am still continuing to figure out how successful some of these things are. But one of my big projects right now is in around end of 2020, what we recognize is fascinating. You look at the Wall Street Journal, they have published an article yearly. We have about close to 50 million Americans with chronic pain. That's probably a small snippet to 350 million people just within the United States. It's a significant amount of the population.
Mhm.
The reality is when you look at most of our therapies, so set aside MIS, you look at neuromodulation therapies, the market penetration is probably about 0.1 to 0.2%. So on average, we do about 100 to 150,000 implants, and you look at how many of those physicians of the 6,000 clinicians, 10 to 20% of them do 80% of the volume, which means that essentially we're not really growing the market in terms of patient access and growing that community. So we got charged with an idea to solve that problem. And the way we went about it is we went back to the wearable space and we found that a lot of great tech with AI can automate the ability to capture a lot of the deeper nerves that you would need an implantable, but at a fraction of the cost. So we scaled up manufacturing to now a production cost of around $10 to $20 a unit, about 1 million units a month. So with large tooling, we're working on trying to do population-based treatment with a low-cost device that has care management services linked to it. And the power in that is I think we're creating a true ecosystem. So Nexum's really, the vision and value to it is, if there's a practice like DxTx, imagine you're treating tens of thousands of patients. You can't put an implant in everybody. You need to understand what their pain generator is. So if you have a front-end electroceutical that can replace ibuprofen, gabapentin, all of the opiates, but still give you pain and diagnostic information, it would radically change the space. So remote monitoring became standard of care in cardiac and diabetes. No one today doesn't talk about CGMs and measuring their glucose and your Apple Health and all of these different wearables that are now kind of becoming front and center. We believe we've got the best tool to measure that. Now, what I've learned is you can have the best idea in the world, but to commercialize it is a totally different concept. So I'm learning that, the more time I look on the flip side of this, I understand sometimes, as a physician, you're always like, why does industry charge this? Like, what is their deal? Like, why is it so expensive? Because it takes so much effort to get a product into the market, let alone run a practice. So I think we're trying to really change the way that you can penetrate the market without the cost burden on the service side. And in 2 years, we have treated about 5,000 patients. I mean, we're growing about a 200% year-on-year growth. It's been quite an unbelievable journey, but it's still a startup. I mean, every day it's like you got another problem to fix, but really enjoy the entrepreneurial side because I think it forces your brain to work on so many different levels and problem
Very
solve.
neat. I knew you were coming on, so I checked with our auth folks. Said, hey, how many
Yeah.
with next? We have quite a few in process right now, which is pretty
I know.
exciting.
It
Yeah.
is exciting. So we're really hoping that this partnership becomes a model for the country because I think we are doing it right. There are a lot of RTM companies that have gotten in trouble for poor documentation, poor ways that don't follow the CMS guidelines. And you kind of see some situation with the coding changes that are happening in 2027. So I think we're well prepared for it. And I think generally compliance, staying with what is expected to meet the billing standards is always so important. So we try to be a partner to the clinics.
Fantastic. So when you're not seeing patients, when you're not leading Aspen, when you're not researching or lecturing around the world, what do you do to kind of refill the cup to decompress?
Well, so when I was doing basketball with all of the college students on the weekend. So interestingly, I jokingly say I have the nickname called Air India. It's hilarious. I
That's
played
great.
JV in high school and I just wasn't growing fast enough to keep up with the varsity team, but I still love team sports. So I briefly got into pickleball. So Pat Buchanan, I'm gonna have to eventually challenge him at this point. But I try to stay as active as possible. I got a 10 and 8-year-old, and I always say time is the single most important choices that we make, and I think you have to try to keep somewhat of a work-life balance. So my two kids keep me pretty entertained in the time that I don't have. But I'm a big avid sports guy. I can't do the running piece because I feel like I like the workout piece, but just I enjoy more active sports. So between tennis, pickleball, and the occasional basketball court, but we used to be much more frequent. But man, I would get beaten up, but really try and make time for family. That's kind of
Impressive that you're able to balance all that and fit that in.
Yeah, you should ask my kids, Mike. They're always competing for the time, so it's funny.
Yeah. Mine are all much older now, but I do fondly remember those times. Dr. Chakravarthy, thank you so much for coming on the DxTx Partners podcast. We really look forward to. We have so many of our physicians that are involved with Aspen and working with you and the great things that you do. We really appreciate that partnership, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.